Inheriting shadows, the unraveling of a father's empire, a daughter's awakening, and the silent legacy that bound blood, secrets, and power beyond the grave. Yenna stood quietly in front of the window, her reflection merging with the city's nocturnal glow. Seoul pulsed with life beyond the estate's perimeter, vibrant, chaotic, and distant. It had always been distant, ever since she had chosen to leave it behind. The music school nestled in the quiet European countryside, the anonymous streets, and the gentle simplicity of the life she had built for herself. It had all been by design. She had lived deliberately far from the gravitational pull of her father's influence, and she had done it without regret. But all of it had shattered with a single phone call. The news of her father's death was not softened by time or familiarity. It came like a crack of thunder in the middle of a clear day, unexpected and without the comfort of preparation. She hadn't wept, not in the moment. There had been too much confusion, too much unresolved space between them. They had been estranged not through malice, but through the simple erosion of affection over time and silence. Returning to Seoul was not a choice, it was an inevitability. The will summoned her, along with the lingering specter of her father's legacy. The estate stood cold and unwelcoming, a monument to wealth and power built by a man she had never truly understood. Her first steps back into the family home were hesitant. Marble floors echoed beneath her feet as she walked halls that once whispered with distant childhood memories, now faded. Everything felt staged, sterile, curated, and emotionless. The servants moved around her like ghosts, formal and distant, as if unsure of how to treat the daughter who had never been part of the empire's inner workings. Her father's lawyer had greeted her the next morning with a thick envelope and a rehearsed solemnity. Inside, the contents of the will unraveled more than a mere distribution of assets. There were stipulations, explicit conditions. Her inheritance was bound to leadership, to stewardship of the conglomerate her father had built over decades. If she refused, everything would pass to the next eligible heir. Yenna had always assumed there were other heirs, other branches of the family her father had supported from a distance. She hadn't asked questions. She never wanted the answers. But now, the very structure of her life was being redirected by a man no longer living. She spent the first few days attempting to comprehend what the company even was anymore. The family business had grown exponentially since she was a child. Now, it wasn't just one company. It was a network of subsidiaries, shell corporations, and foreign investments. She read reports she didn't understand, sat in on meetings that left her overwhelmed, and listened to board members who questioned her presence behind polite smiles and veiled skepticism. There was no grace period. Her last name afforded her power but not confidence. The pressure came quickly. Press briefings, internal memos, and looming decisions demanded her input. With every passing hour, the empire shifted under her feet. The estate offered no solace. It was a shell now. Her father's presence lingered not in warmth or familiarity, but in the objects he left behind. Books meticulously organized, portraits lining the hallways, and framed newspaper articles celebrating decades of business dominance. The silence was thick, like grief trapped in architecture. But Yenna's curiosity grew alongside her responsibilities. She began to dig, not deliberately at first, but instinctively. Her father's office was still intact, untouched since his passing. The drawers were locked, the desk cluttered but impersonal. What began as a half-hearted exploration turned into a quiet obsession. There were inconsistencies she couldn't ignore. Account books with unusual transfers, correspondence with names she didn't recognize, and property deeds from other countries under different aliases. And always, that sense that she had only seen the surface of her father's life. And then there was Ji-hoon. Her half-brother's name emerged early in the process, a faint echo in boardroom gossip and legal documents. He had never lived at the estate. He wasn't present at the funeral. His existence had always been peripheral in Yenna's mind, acknowledged but never explored. Now, with their father gone, the boundaries between them began to dissolve. She had seen him only once in the last decade, at an awkward family gathering she barely remembered. He had been quiet, almost invisible. But now, his name was everywhere. Legal correspondences, boardroom discussions, journal entries she uncovered in her father's handwriting. There was something unsettling about Ji-hoon's absence. It wasn't avoidance, it was orchestration. He was missing in ways that seemed too deliberate. Her father's estate had left behind no personal letters addressed to him, no photographs, no mementos. And yet, the inheritance was split with specific assets tied to Ji-hoon's name. The imbalance gnawed at her. Why had her father left certain properties in Ji-hoon's hands while binding the company to Yenna? What did Ji-hoon know that she didn't? In her father's private quarters, she found the photograph. It was worn at the edges, hidden in a drawer beneath layers of unrelated paperwork. A woman, mid-30s, with serene eyes and a child in her lap. The child's face was half-turned, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The eyes, dark and intense, were her father's. But it was the woman that haunted her. Yenna didn't recognize her. not from old photographs, not from family history. Yet the photo had been hidden with care, tucked away like a memory too valuable to destroy, but too painful to confront. The discovery sent her deeper into her father's records. Legal filings, property titles, sealed envelopes. Patterns emerged. Payments to anonymous trusts, small apartment purchases under assumed names, and one entry that led her to a bookstore tucked between two commercial buildings in a forgotten part of the city. The store was unremarkable. Dust lined the shelves, and the wooden floor creaked beneath her steps. It was like stepping into another time. But there, in a locked drawer behind the counter, she found more. Letters written in her father's hand. Addressed not to board members or legal advisors, but to the woman in the photograph. They were never sent. Some were dated before Yenna was born, others just months before his death. The contents revealed a side of her father she had never known, vulnerable, apologetic. He spoke of the child he couldn't acknowledge, of the choices he had made, and of the guilt that had followed him through his life. The child, Ji-hoon, had lived outside the estate's light. His mother had raised him in quiet defiance, refusing to ask for support but accepting what was necessary. Her father had complied in silence, maintaining the illusion of separation while orchestrating care from afar. Yenna felt the weight of it like a stone in her chest. Her father had built an empire out of control, power, and strategy, but he had failed at the simplest thing: connection. Back at the estate, her understanding of everything shifted. The empire wasn't just built on wealth, it was built on fragmentation. Each room now echoed differently. The library, once a place of authority, now felt like a chamber of secrets. The boardroom, a stage for performance. Even her father's chair seemed less like a throne and more like a confessional. The board of directors continued to press her. The company's stock was fluctuating with uncertainty about her leadership. Investors grew impatient. There were murmurs of coups, veiled discussions about competency, and whispers that Ji-hoon might be the better choice. But Ji-hoon remained absent. No contact, no statements, no appearance, and somehow that absence had begun to feel like a strategy of its own. As days passed, Yenna tried to assert herself in the business world, leaning on advisors, consultants, and trusted lieutenants. But she knew the company didn't trust her. She wasn't her father. And the more she tried to emulate his strength, the more glaring the differences became. She wasn't ruthless. She hesitated. She asked questions. She demanded transparency where secrecy had once reigned. Some saw that as weakness. Others saw it as the future. The schism widened, within the company, within herself. She began to wonder if Ji-hoon's silence was meant to lure her deeper into a game she didn't understand, or if he, too, was trapped in the web their father had left behind. One evening, she returned to the office late, unable to sleep. The weight of the day sat heavily on her shoulders. On the desk was a new envelope, unmarked, delivered by hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper. It was a transcript, a record of a meeting, her father, Ji-hoon, a third unnamed person. The content was cryptic, but the implications were profound. Discussions of offshore transfers, silent partners, and a phrase repeated more than once: she must never know. She realized she hadn't just inherited a company. She had inherited a labyrinth. Not just a trail of secrets, but an entire architecture of deception. And now every decision she made pulled her deeper into its center. The transcript sat on her father's desk like a relic, its presence too deliberate to be a coincidence. Yenna stared at it long after the sun began to rise. It was as if someone wanted her to see it, not just to discover the secrets buried within, but to be changed by them. The message was clear. There were things she was never meant to know. But the deeper she was pulled into the shadows of her father's empire, the less willing she became to obey its unspoken rules. She began to reconstruct her father's life piece by piece, mapping timelines, reviewing financial records, and tracing names that surfaced only in encrypted memos or bank transactions routed through obscure channels. What started as a daughter trying to fulfill an unwanted inheritance became something else entirely, a relentless pursuit of truth. Not just about the business. About the man who had shaped her life from afar, and whose absence had become more suffocating than his presence ever was. Her days were now consumed by strategy sessions, internal power struggles, and mounting pressure from a board that questioned her every move. Yet it was her nights that revealed the true weight of the legacy she bore. Each evening, she returned to the estate not as an heir, but as an archaeologist excavating a tomb of secrets. With each new discovery, the ground beneath her shifted. Among the documents recovered from hidden safes and coded files, she uncovered a contract, an agreement forged decades earlier between her father and an international conglomerate masked by intermediaries. The document outlined a partnership not based on shared vision, but on leverage and blackmail. Her father had maintained control not through trust, but through control of information, mutual threats, and debts owed by powerful people who now watched her every move from behind their polished facades. More disturbing was the pattern of asset transfers to foundations and individuals that could not be traced to any legitimate partner. Shell companies led to more shell companies. Trusts dissolved and reformed in new jurisdictions. It was a network designed to remain undiscovered, but her father had kept just enough of it hidden in plain sight, perhaps as a contingency, perhaps as a form of confession. And now that he was gone, it had all landed in her lap. Her investigations led her farther from the corporate towers and deeper into the hidden places of the city. Old archives, derelict buildings once registered under the company's name, and people long dismissed or fired without cause. She began to see a pattern not of wealth accumulation, but of something more purposeful. There were communities her father had quietly supported, families who received untraceable payments, children sent to school overseas under mysterious sponsorships. Not everything was sinister. Some of it seemed like penance, a parallel life, a quieter, more human one, that had existed beneath the gleaming surface of the empire. And yet, the darker elements could not be ignored. The more she learned, the more she realized her father had not been alone. A circle of loyalist advisors, legal counselors, and executives had protected his secrets with fanatical discipline. These were the people she now sat across from in meetings, smiling, nodding, and watching. They were not allies. They were caretakers of a kingdom now threatened by her curiosity. Within this network, she uncovered a name she hadn't expected to find: Ji-hoon. Not just as a beneficiary, but as a participant. There were correspondences encrypted within company servers that hinted at his involvement in operations her father had kept hidden from public records. His absence no longer felt like detachment. It felt like strategy. He had been groomed, not ignored. Prepared in the shadows, while she had been left in the light. The realization struck her with cold clarity. The empire had never been built for her. It had been built around them both, two heirs on opposite paths, one molded through deliberate distance, the other through silent preparation. Her response was instinctive. She launched a private audit, bypassing traditional chains of command. Consultants from outside the company, unknown to the inner circle, were brought in to comb through everything: contracts, digital communication, asset history. What they found was staggering. Entire branches of the conglomerate had been manipulated to funnel funds into a separate structure, one still legally under the company's name but functionally autonomous. At the center of it all was a trust, a master fund formed a year before her father's death, designed to activate upon a specific set of triggers. And those triggers had now been met. This trust, protected by ironclad legal boundaries, was under Ji-hoon's name. The truth was finally visible in its entirety. Her father had set the stage for a quiet transfer of power, not publicly, but structurally. The company's core assets would remain in place under Yena's leadership, but its liquidity, its maneuverability, and its future had been handed to Ji-hoon. Yena had inherited the skeleton. Ji-hoon had inherited the pulse. The news broke inside her like glass. She had believed her father had chosen her, against all odds, to carry forward what he had built. But now she saw that she had only been chosen to stabilize it, to preserve its face. Ji-hoon was the contingency, the hand that would shape the company's next phase under the surface, invisible yet absolute. She had become a figurehead, and she realized that everything, her father's sudden will, the orchestrated silence, and the inheritance of a crumbling house of secrets, had been part of a much more intricate design. Still, she refused to collapse under it. Instead of retreating, Yena acted. She turned her focus to what she could control. She began restructuring the public face of the company, expanding philanthropic programs, auditing internal labor practices, and pushing for transparency in operations that had long thrived in ambiguity. It wasn't just a strategy. It was defiance. Her moves were met with resistance. Executives resigned. Stockholders rebelled. Anonymous leaks to the press painted her as inexperienced and impulsive. But for every crisis, she responded with quiet determination. Her goal was not to dismantle the empire. She couldn't. It was too vast. But she could reshape it, redirect its future into something less corrosive, less anchored in secrecy. Her private life shrank to a point of singularity. Friends faded away. Her music, once a sanctuary, was abandoned in its entirety. The estate became a war room, the company a battlefield. Her image in the press fluctuated between reluctant savior and corporate villainess. She never saw Ji-hoon in person. But he made his presence known, strategic investments made through proxy firms, meetings where his influence was felt but never confirmed, shareholder votes swayed by unseen hands. And then one day, a letter arrived unsigned, typed, and unemotional. It outlined an offer, an amicable division of power, a reorganization that would remove her from the executive board but grant her permanent control over the philanthropic and cultural branches of the conglomerate. A quiet retirement, framed as a graceful transition. The public narrative could be managed. Her name would remain, but her authority would not. She didn't respond, not in writing, not with words. Instead, she doubled her efforts. She formed new partnerships outside the traditional markets, recruited from universities and underrepresented sectors, created independent revenue streams within the company that she alone controlled. It was no longer about honoring her father's legacy, it was about surviving it. The photo of the woman and child remained on her desk throughout it all, not as a token of loss, but as a reminder of origin. It anchored her, even as everything else threatened to tear her loose. Years passed. The city changed again, its skyline evolving, its heartbeat quickening. The empire, too, transformed. Some parts bloomed under her influence, others withered under Ji-hoon's silence. The company survived, though neither of them truly controlled it now. It had become its own organism, fed by momentum and legacy, drifting farther from both of them with each passing quarter. Yenna aged in ways she hadn't expected, not visibly, but internally. The brightness that once lit her path dimmed into a quiet resilience. She no longer searched for answers. She simply lived among the ruins of revelation. On the final day she walked through the estate, it was spring. The air carried the scent of renewal. The walls, once cold, felt like monuments instead of prisons. Her steps echoed not with grief, but with conclusion. She left behind the keys, the portraits, the silence. What she took with her could not be measured in wealth or power, but in understanding. Her father had built something vast, but incomplete. Ji-hoon had inherited its bones. She had inherited its soul.